Ukraine's accused of a war crime after 20 people are killed and dozens injured in a ballistic missile attack on central Donetsk.
Мы, пришли снимать деньги и с бабушкой, и потом прилетел снаряд. В ногу чуть-чуть попало.
Meanwhile, people in the city of Mariupol have finally managed to escape the area. Locals tell us what they've endured in one of the epicenters of the conflict.
С Мариуполя выехали, там ад. Стрельба со всех сторон, большие разрушения. Негде брать продукты, ты готовишь на костре все время.
RT visits one of the areas near Kiev where humanitarian efforts are underway, with Russian forces helping those most in need.
This humanitarian effort is not only meant to help people who are left to survive in dire conditions, but also to probably change their hearts and minds.
And we look at attempts by Western media to whitewash Adolf Hitler's crimes as they compare the Russian president to the Nazi leader. From Moscow to the world, this is RT International. I'm Peter Scott, and these are the top stories this hour. Russia's defense ministry says a deadly ballistic missile strike in the center of Donetsk is a war crime, alleging the Ukrainian strike was intentionally aimed at a populated area in the very center of the city, which Kiev vehemently denies. A warning to viewers, you may find some of the following images disturbing. Twenty civilians were killed and at least 36 injured, including children. The street was strewn with bodies and splattered with blood. Distraught people were seen screaming and crying. We heard from one of those lucky enough to survive the attack.
Двое пострадавших увезли, двое двухсотых. Меня спасло то, что я вышла на улицу через дорогу.
Мы, пришли снимать деньги и с бабушкой, и потом прилетел снаряд. В ногу чуть-чуть попало. Я додумался головой туда внутрь, и потом мы с бабушкой пришли домой, вызвали скорую, и дальше повезли и все делали.
Ты испугался? Что ты чувствовал? Было страшно?
Кричал, было такое. Но страшно не было, я кричал только. Смотреть на такие бомбы не надо. И это я вам всем говорю, кто в каком-то случае такие окажутся, сразу куда-то бегите, не смотрите на бомбы сами.
This footage shows the aftermath shortly after the missile strike. A number of buildings in the area were left badly damaged and cars burnt out. Locals helped medics load people onto ambulances. The missile that was shot down was said to have been carrying cluster munitions, which subsequently exploded. Donetsk officials say if it wasn't intercepted, it would have had a blast radius of 500 meters. They also claimed it was an act of terror by Ukraine, something the Ukrainian authorities deny.
The fact the rocket was equipped with cluster munitions proves the aim of the Ukrainian nationalist strike on the city was to kill a maximum amount of civilians. I draw your attention to the fact that the decision to use such missiles will only have been made after the approval of the leadership of the armed forces of Ukraine in Kiev. All this once again confirms the essence of a Nazi and anti-human ruling regime in Ukraine.
Well, nevertheless, the latest meeting of the UN Security Council and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe focused solely on alleged Russian war crimes in the conflict, claims Russia was quick to reject.
Russian troops continue to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine, erasing any difference with their Nazi predecessors 80 years ago.
Russia is accused of the gravest war crimes.
Possible war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Over the past few days, the UN has repeatedly referred to the topic of mediation in the conflict. What kind of mediation can we talk about when it's clear that you've obviously taken a side in this conflict?
Well, geopolitical analyst Patrick Henningsen thinks that the West should remember all the crimes it allowed to be committed throughout the last 8 years in the Donbass, while also not forgetting about its own.
By censoring all of Russian news sources, which is what the West have done, okay? What Western governments and Google have done is effectively block any visibility of any war crimes in, let's say, the Donbass region, for instance. But, you know, that's been going on now for 8 years. But if you did a survey among Americans or British or Europeans, they wouldn't have any idea that there's any ongoing bloody civil war being waged, in this case, largely by the sort of ethno-nationalist brigades within the Ukrainian military. And so this is an effort to push out Russian-speaking people from the region. So few in the West wouldn't have any idea that there's this type of a war going on, this type of, you could say, ethnic cleansing in this case. And it's one of the key, if not the key reasons why Moscow moved to intervene both on a humanitarian basis and on a military basis. Now, the West may say that that version of events is Russian propaganda, but, you know, to the millions of people who actually live in that region, they would say that that's the truth of the situation.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian troops have been partially forced from one of the recent hotspots in the city of Mariupol. The Russian Defense Ministry says it's finally been possible to open humanitarian corridors. Numerous buses have arrived to evacuate those who want to leave. And earlier there were reports that the Ukrainian forces had been preventing locals from fleeing. However, around 160 families have recently used their own transport to escape the city via detours. But as the route they used was unofficial, local authorities said they couldn't guarantee people's security. Those who did manage to flee said it was a miracle they got out.
Как вам удалось выехать? Ведь говорят, что не выпускают киевские власти.
Чудом, вот на свой страх и риск. Вот это вот семью брал и ехали на удачу. Вот. Связи нет, вообще нет. Мы не знаем даже, кто где стоит. Там холодно, голодно, воды нет, еды нет, ничего нет. У нас домов нету. Они сгорели. Все. Мы, как это? Бомжи.
Мы с Мариуполя выехали, там ад. Стрельба со всех сторон, большие разрушения. Вчера там один магазин, который был, остался продуктовый, в котором покупать можно было продукты, его подорвали. Негде брать продукты, ты готовишь на костре все время. Ну, каша была, поймите. Тут ты идешь, не понимаешь, свистит, гудит самолет, внизу стреляют, тут рядом зенитка, рядом с тобой, где ты в убежище, то есть понимаешь, что в обратку может прилететь. Мы пробыли в этом аду вот с самого начала, собственно. И уже сегодня просто случайно узнали, что есть какой-то коридор через там море, и мы вот выскочили.
Well, not far from the city of Mariupol, Russian troops have swept through a base belonging to a neo-Nazi paramilitary group where forces deserted without any resistance. RT's Murad Gazdiev has all the details.
Berdyansk, population 100,000. Formerly home to one of Ukraine's most elite artillery regiments. This is what the demilitarization of Ukraine looks like in practice. We're at a former base of Ukrainian Marines, an artillery detachment that had these 152mm howitzers in service, along with vast quantities of ammunition. With these, they plan to sink or severely hurt the Russian Black Sea Fleet. That didn't happen. The base was captured quickly. The detachment here deserted. As you can see, these cannons have been put out of action. They have been immobilized, the tires burned, but again, the Russian side has said that it intends to destroy them permanently. These cannons burned just before our arrival. As Russian troops swept through the area, they disabled all military hardware they came across. There was no resistance. Ukrainian forces had abandoned the base, along with everything stored here. This scene tells volumes about morale among Ukrainian troops. This used to be an elite artillery detachment. All the troops here fled, deserted before the fighting started. Here you can see mountains of clothes, uniforms, and all the boots discarded by servicemen. As they fled, they left everything that could identify them as Ukrainian troops behind. We were unable to find out why they had deserted, whether it was panic or whether they just didn't want a part in this fight. They may have heard Russia's calls for Ukrainian troops to lay down their weapons and return home. Whatever the case, the locals were relieved.
На сегодняшний день это свобода его нету здесь.
А самой власти к своей как относитесь, к украинской?
Ну а как можно? Нет, какая власть? Вы догадайтесь сами. Город Бердянск, он не тронутый. Это не Мариуполь. Да ну хватит, Вова. Я вот это стою, мне 65 лет. Я плачу, потому что я не могу. Я хожу на работу. Я боюсь за вот этого человека, за вот этого, за любого.
As we filmed, troops thoroughly swept and cleared military facilities, barracks and bases that they came across. While regular Ukrainian servicemen have been eager to negotiate, nationalists and neo-Nazis have not. This was the base of Sarmat, a Ukrainian neo-Nazi paramilitary group. Adorning the walls here were images of Stepan Bandera, a Nazi collaborator whose forces murdered countless thousands of Jews. It is these groups, like Sarmat, that Russia says it is after, that they are the target of denazification. And with every day, as Russian troops advance, there's less and less room left for them to hide. Morad Gazdiev from Berdyansk, Ukraine.
Fighting has been reported in Kharkov, where the central market is said to be on fire after coming under shelling. Some residential buildings were also destroyed in the battles. Now, this footage shows the aftermath of a residential building being hit in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. You can see firefighters trying to bring the situation under control, and we heard from people who live in the area.
A rocket hit the building. At first I saw the blast, and in 5 to 6 seconds there was an explosion. The entrance door was simply blown out.
We were sleeping. My mom woke me up. Everything was in smoke. We ran into the storage room to hide. Some explosion started. We thought that someone was breaking in. It was really scary.
Well, despite those scenes of devastation, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is still optimistic about the post-war future of his country.
You should know that we will restore everything, we will renovate everything, every street of every city, every house, every apartment of every Ukrainian. I'm sure we will be able to do so quickly after the war. We will direct all our forces, all the help of the world to this goal. We are already forming funds in order that Ukraine lives.
Humanitarian efforts are well underway, with Russian forces helping those most in need. Our correspondent Igor Zhdanov has been seeing how aid efforts are playing out on the ground.
So Russia's advance here on the Kievan front is challenging in so many new ways. For example, in the east and in the south, there's a good share of locals who sympathize Russia. Here, on the other hand, that number is significantly lower. So this humanitarian effort is not only meant to help people who are left to survive in dire conditions, but also to probably change their hearts and minds.
Wells have run dry in this village. Shops ran out of food within hours of fighting breaking out, and a disrupted power too. The front line has moved away from these homes towards Kiev, but still afraid, local residents prefer to shelter in their basements during the long, cold nights.
There we sit to hide. Here's the basement. It is damp and wet. No, don't go in, it stinks now, because we have heated it a little.
The closer we get to Kiev, the more desolated the streets become. I mean, this village, just under 35 kilometers away from the Ukrainian capital, has been almost completely abandoned by the locals. And I mean, there's nothing left here, no food. Like, for example, this fencing was meant to protect the windows of this little tiny shop, but, well, it has clearly failed. There's shattered glass all over the street. This window has been completely broken down. This is how the marauders got in. And you can see the place is utterly and completely ransacked. There's nothing there.
Some villagers sharing pro-Russian views are concerned that the aid, in part, may end up in the hands of the guerrilla squads who continue to prowl the nearby forests. But to take this aid away would mean sentencing civilians to a certain death. Most people here have their own tiny swathes of farmland and stockpiles of canned goods. This is how they've continued to put food on their tables so far. What they don't have is access to medicine.
About what's needed. Look, people bring prescriptions. There's an urgent need for insulin, hard drugs. These are the most important things. We share food. People have absolutely no flour. We'll distribute some flour, which was brought earlier, as people have had no bread for a few weeks.
Our child was ill and we asked for help. We were told that there is a doctor, a military woman, who can tell whether we are doing everything right or not. No one offends us. No one is rude to us. We can walk about calmly.
Mingling with the locals here is a surprising face. A former MP elected before the 2014 revolution. He had been living in exile, persecuted for his pro-Russian views, but now he's back home.
We've been here from the first day of the war, from the very start. We provide locals with humanitarian aid, work with them. The Ukrainian army destroyed infrastructure after leaving. People have no electricity and therefore no water. It needs repair. Most of the places where Russian troops remain are safe now. So lay down your weapons, come back home. If you haven't committed war crimes, you won't be punished at all. Come back home, help your people. It's time to come back to work. We need to rebuild our country. No one will do it aside from us. When we tell them the truth about the events of 2014, people will change their view. They are helping soldiers, providing them with food, baths, or some small things. If you came to rescue us, do not leave us again. If you came, do not leave us.
US politicians are in such a hurry to condemn Russia and Belarus over the unfolding events in Ukraine that they seem to have forgotten even basic historic facts.
Belarus is not in a Warsaw Pact. Belarus should become a legitimate target by NATO if this is true. It's a way to indirectly respond without directly attacking Russia.
This, of course, is not true, as Belarus was in fact in the Warsaw Pact, as the document was signed by the Soviet Union, which at the time Belarus was a part of. Fortunately, there were people to point out to the US congressman.
How the can he be a member of Congress, let alone be so beloved by the media? His stupidity is surpassed only by his bloodthirsty sociopathy. The Warsaw Pact hasn't existed since 1991. Belarus was in it, as part of the USSR. It was replaced by the CSTO. Belarus is a member.
Meanwhile, some are even going so far as to compare President Putin to Hitler, including the former US ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, who was interviewed on MSNBC and whose historically incorrect words were posted on the anchor's Twitter account without quotation marks.
One difference between Putin and Hitler is that Hitler didn't kill ethnic Germans, German-speaking people. Putin slaughters the very people he said he has come to liberate.
Well, Mr. Fall clearly doesn't remember that Hitler put hundreds of thousands of ethnic Germans into labour and concentration camps, including political opponents and homosexuals. After drawing criticism, the show hosted by Liberal figurehead Rachel Maddow did take down the tweet and issue an apology. Still, others seem to agree with the sentiment that Putin is worse than Hitler.
Hitler did not use his office to extract bribes and get into bed with organized crime, so we could say that in the terms of civic values Hitler was even a more decent person than Putin is, as crazy as it sounds.
Hitler and Putin have many similarities. They were both racists, neo-imperialist, anti-democratic, alien to human values, furious and not very rational, though Hitler was fast and Putin rather slow.
Journalist and political commentator Richard Medhurst is concerned US politicians are foregoing facts in favour of escalating the crisis.
It's so embarrassing. Adam Kinzinger, the one who thinks that the Warsaw Pact still exists and that Belarus isn't a part of it. I mean, this guy is not just in the US Congress, he's in the military. Well, what do they teach them in the U.S. military? I mean, did he not think that there was perhaps something wrong going on when he didn't hear anything being discussed about the Warsaw Pact? And really embarrassing for someone to be in the U.S. Congress. I mean, that's really dangerous. It shows you not just the you know, how bloodthirsty they are, but also how ignorant they are. And it's all across the board. I wouldn't say it's just something about Russia. You know, you've seen people also the way they speak about Palestine and other conflicts, Syria. They really show that they don't really know what they're talking about. So I think that's probably very, very good for the decision makers in Washington. Whoever is the enemy of the day becomes Hitler. And I think it's very dangerous to draw these comparisons, because what they're doing is showing that they're historically illiterate. They're ignorant about the current situation, and they're also minimizing what Hitler did. You know, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they've all walked back their policies on praising Nazis. So now it's apparently okay to go online and say death to Russians and death to Putin and praise neo-Nazis. But if you call out the neo-Nazis, if you show that NATO, for example, was posting tweets where you have soldiers in Ukraine wearing the black sun symbol, the Schwarze Sonne, you get banned for that. You get censored for that. It's really mass hysteria on another scale. And I think it's particularly insulting because in World War II, the Russians lost more than anyone else. They inflicted 80% of German casualties, and they lost over 20 million people fighting the Germans, fighting the Nazis. So I think it's all the more insulting, in addition to being historically illiterate, to compare the Russians to Nazis. I think this is really out of bounds.
Now, the conflict in Ukraine has created challenges for some European politicians, and that's all due to their alliances, either current or past. Here's how Italy's Matteo Salvini was greeted by a Polish mayor during a recent trip to meet Ukrainian refugees.
I have a personal comment for Senator Salvini. Senator, I would like us to go together to the refugee centre at the border to see what your friend Putin has done, what the person you describe as your friend has done. I would ask you to wear this T-shirt if we go there.
Now, just to give you some background, Salvini is the leader of Italy's right-wing League party, and he was once photographed wearing a T-shirt showing President Putin's image. He's also posted messages of support for the Russian leader on social media. He's found himself facing increasing pressure since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, and he's not the only figure to be affected by his political convictions, with many other conservative leaders now criticised by their left-wing European counterparts.
I have already had the occasion to condemn the military invasion decided by Vladimir Putin. Those who have been defending his policies for years are irresponsible and have damaged our national interests.
Earlier, we discussed the issue with political analysts Chris Bambury and Jean Bricmont, and they say it's concerning that being anti-NATO automatically leads to claims of being pro-Putin.
Left and right politicians are accused of being Putin lovers, although I don't think they are. Maybe some right-wing politicians at some point were, but the left-wing politician like Mélenchon in France is also attacked for being pro-Putin, although he's not pro-Putin, he's just against NATO, he's just against, flaming the flames, and he wants to de-escalate the conflict, and I think he's right.
I think the centre-left in Europe have been, in many ways, along with the Liberals, worse than the right. I have no sympathy with the right, but in many ways, they have been up there demanding no-fly zones, further sanctions, etc. And it's really a situation where, as you say, anyone who attempts to place this war in a context by making it clear that they're against the invasion of Ukraine, as I am, but then saying you have to put it in the context of NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, the build-up of NATO forces around Russia, the breaking of that promise to Gorbachev back in the day that NATO would not move eastward. You have to put it inside that context. So there is very little slack here. But I also want to make a caveat that polls show that in the United States and the UK and elsewhere, a majority of the population are against their countries participating directly in this war. So while we have those hawks, particularly on the centre-left and in the liberal circles, the popular mood is not so gung-ho about sending our boys into fight in Ukraine.
I don't think I've ever seen something like that, even during the Cold War. But you see, I also agree with Chris that the problem is really the center the so-called center, let's say center-right or center-left, because they are the worst. You see, they are the ones who are more gung-ho. They are for the no-fly zone. They are for sending troops. I mean, if they could, they would send troops. They're afraid of doing so. But nevertheless, the rhetoric is absolutely unbelievable. And every dissident voice is demonized as being pro-Putin, fascist, Nazis, etc. It's ridiculous.
YouTube has slapped a global ban on all media linked to the Russian government and even within Russia itself. The company cited its policy, which restricts content that denies, minimizes or trivializes well-documented violent events. But RT's Don Coulter has been looking into how well the company itself follows its own rules.
RT, Sputnik, even our video agency, Ruptly, all banned on YouTube. Its parent company, Google, seems to be gradually silencing anything that doesn't fit the West's version of the truth. And at the same time, George W. Bush's jokes about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq are still fair game.
Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here.
As many as 1.2 million people died for that joke, casualties of a war the U.S. justified with a search for deadly weapons that ended up not existing. But Bush isn't alone in the pool of U.S. presidents with a dark sense of humor. His successor, Barack Obama, actually ordered 10 times as many drone strikes and yet somehow won a Nobel Peace Prize and thinks Predator drones are a joke.
The Jonas brothers are here. They're out there somewhere. Sasha and Malia are huge fans, but boys don't get any ideas. I have 2 words for you: Predator drones. You will never see it coming. You think I'm joking?
Who could forget 2016 presidential candidate Hillary Clinton's blood-curdling cackling, which followed NATO's 2011 bombing of Libya and the killing of its president, Muammar Gaddafi?
We came, we saw, he died.
So jokes about brutal invasions that collectively led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people are okay on YouTube, but Russian media is not? It sure raises questions as to what so-called community YouTube is actually beholden to.
American journalist Dan Cohen says Washington can't pretend to be a democracy on the one hand and yet control how information spreads on the other.
The U.S. calls itself democratic, but, it used to be that the Soviet Union, banned information back in old times, and there was information that was smuggled out. And so now the United States, claiming to be a democracy, has banned certain information. It is criminalizing certain types of thought. I mean, we're seeing now that Tucker Carlson, the most popular television host in the United States, and former member of Congress Tulsi Gabbard are being accused of treason and of being puppets of Vladimir Putin simply for talking about the biological laboratories that are in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe that are documented and factual. And so we are seeing these calls to say that they are guilty of treason, which actually is punishable by death. So we're reaching a very dangerous and extreme moment in the United States.
Well, that's all for this hour. For all the latest developments on the conflict in Ukraine, head over to RT.com. My name's Peter Scott, and thank you for watching.